Welcome back to XRP Update. What if one section hidden inside the Clarity Act could become one of the biggest catalysts XRP has ever seen? Not because of hype, not because of speculation, but because it could directly impact XRP's supply, Ripple's distribution strategy, and potentially how the entire market values XRP moving forward. Today, we're taking a closer look at what many investors believe is the first of two major catalysts that could eventually create a true XRP supply shock. And if you've been wondering why some XRP holders still talk about higher long-term price targets despite years of delays and uncertainty, this is one of the most important discussions you can understand. Because this isn't about rumors, it's about legislation, it's about supply, and it's about what could happen if the Clarity Act moves forward with certain provisions intact. Now, if you watched yesterday's update, you'll know we discussed two specific catalysts that many investors are paying close attention to. The first catalyst revolves around a section inside the Clarity Act. The second catalyst is Ripple potentially completing its XRP distribution plan and eventually ending its ongoing XRP sales. Today we're focusing specifically on the first catalyst because understanding it helps explain why so many people believe the second catalyst could eventually follow. Now, before we dive into the details, there has been growing optimism surrounding the Clarity Act itself. Recent comments from lawmakers suggest that if momentum continues, the legislation could move relatively quickly through the process. Of course, nobody knows exactly when the final version will arrive, and there are always delays, negotiations, and revisions involved with major legislation. But for today's discussion, let's assume the Clarity Act reaches the finish line sometime around the end of summer. Because once that happens, another process begins, and that's where things get interesting. One of the most discussed provisions involves what many refer to as the ownership threshold for blockchain networks. In simple terms, the legislation attempts to define what a mature and decentralized blockchain network looks like. Among the requirements is a provision that limits how much control insiders or affiliated parties can collectively hold. This is the section that immediately gets XRP investors paying attention. Because whenever ownership percentages become part of the conversation, Ripple's XRP holdings naturally become part of that discussion. Now, it's important to understand that the Clarity Act contains different pathways depending on whether a blockchain project is newer or already established. And XRP falls into the established category. The XRP ledger has been operating since 2012. That means it may qualify under provisions specifically designed for networks that were already functioning long before this legislation was introduced. For newer blockchain projects, stricter ownership thresholds may apply. But for pre-existing blockchain networks, there appears to be a different framework. And that's where much of the current debate comes from. Many investors initially focused on the 20% ownership provision. But when you look deeper into the language, there are additional considerations for older blockchain systems that may already satisfy certain decentralization requirements. That's why so many analysts continue examining the details, because the final interpretation matters, the rulemaking process matters, and how regulators ultimately apply these provisions matters. Now here's the key point. Even if XRP qualifies under the less restrictive framework, many investors still believe Ripple ultimately wants to reduce its holdings over time. And that's where the conversation shifts from legal requirements to long-term strategy. For years, Ripple has been distributing XRP through partnerships, institutions, liquidity programs, and ecosystem growth initiatives. This has never been a secret. In fact, Ripple has consistently explained that XRP was designed to be distributed broadly throughout the market. The question has always been how long that process would take, and more importantly, what happens when that process eventually reaches its conclusion. That's where this discussion becomes fascinating. Because if Ripple eventually reaches a point where the majority of its distribution objectives have been completed, the market could begin viewing XRP very differently. Many critics have argued for years that Ripple would continue selling XRP forever. Others believe the sales were always intended to decrease over time as adoption expanded. And this is exactly why the Clarity Act conversation matters. Not necessarily because it forces an immediate change, but because it shines a spotlight on XRP's long-term supply dynamics. Now let's talk about timeline. One of the biggest questions investors keep asking is simple. If Ripple needed to further reduce its holdings, how long would that actually take? Based on current discussions surrounding the legislative process, many estimates suggest that once the law is finalized, regulators would still need time to establish detailed rules and implementation procedures. That means we're not talking about changes happening overnight. We're talking about a process that could unfold over many months, potentially over a year. And that's an important distinction. Because whenever markets identify a future catalyst, they often begin pricing in expectations long before the catalyst actually arrives. We've seen that happen many times across financial markets, and we've certainly seen it happen before in crypto, which brings us to something many long-term XRP holders remember very well. Now, to understand why so many investors are paying attention to this, we need to look at history. Back in 2017, one of the biggest moments in XRP's history was Ripple's escrow announcement. At the time, Ripple locked up billions of XRP into escrow, creating certainty around future supply. Initially, the market reacted, then cooled off, and many people thought the story was over. But months later, once the escrow process was fully completed and confidence started returning to the market, XRP experienced one of the most explosive rallies in crypto history. Now, nobody is saying history will repeat itself exactly the same way. But what many investors see is a similar setup developing. Not the same catalyst, not the same market conditions, but another event that could dramatically change how the market views XRP's future supply. And that's why this Clarity Act discussion matters. Because if Ripple eventually chooses, or is required, to reduce its holdings further, the timeline suddenly becomes very interesting. Based on current estimates, once the legislation is finalized and regulators complete the rulemaking process, Ripple could potentially have a 12 to 18-month window to complete any necessary distribution requirements. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about years and years into the future. We're talking about a time frame that is now visible on the horizon. And here's something many people misunderstand. If Ripple distributes additional XRP, that doesn't automatically mean XRP gets dumped onto retail exchanges. Most of Ripple's distributions occur through institutional channels and over-the-counter transactions. That means they are not being sold directly into the same public order books that everyday retail investors use. This is a critical point because many critics assume additional distribution automatically means downward pressure on price. But the reality is much more nuanced than that. What many investors are focused on is what happens after the distribution process reaches its final stage. Because if Ripple eventually completes that process and reaches the point where ongoing XRP sales are no longer necessary, that's where the second catalyst enters the picture. And for many XRP supporters, that's the moment they've been waiting for. A future where XRP supply distribution is largely complete. A future where the market has greater clarity about circulating supply. And a future where uncertainty surrounding Ripple's holdings finally begins to disappear. Whether that happens exactly as expected remains to be seen. The final language of the Clarity Act still matters. The SEC and CFTC rulemaking process still matters. And the timeline could certainly change. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The conversation around XRP is no longer just about speculation. It's becoming a conversation about regulation, utility, adoption, and supply dynamics. And those are the types of fundamentals that often drive major market shifts. That's why this remains one of the most important stories XRP investors should be watching right now. Because if these catalysts unfold the way many expect, they could fundamentally change how the market views XRP for years to come. As always, stay informed, stay patient, and focus on the facts. If you enjoyed today's XRP update, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss future XRP news and analysis. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next update.